Good morning, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Carlos Phillips, President and CEO of the Greenville Chamber. We host these Community Matters discussions every week to connect you with local, state, and national leaders. You can find past recordings, as well as the upcoming Community Matters schedule at greenvillechamber.org. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. All attendees should be on mute with your cameras turned off. And feel free to submit questions through the chat feature. We want this to be an interactive discussion. And now on with today's show. Today, we're bringing back a Community Matters favorite, Julie Godshall Brown, President and owner of Godshall Recruiting and Staffing, to share with us best practices for preparing for and finding that next career opportunity. Good morning, Julie.
Good morning, Carlos. Thank you for having me.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm so glad to have you back on the show. And this actually gives me an opportunity to get a little revenge on you, Julie. You may remember that about 4.5 years ago, you were on the search committee that interviewed me for this job. And you were probably you asked the most difficult questions throughout that interview process. So I am happy that today I get a little payback.
But you know what? Just look at the results of that, Carlos. We are so blessed to have you here in Greenville. So I'm glad to be a part of that.
Well, Julie, thank you. We're happy to be here as well. Let's jump right into the show. What does the employment landscape look like today? I mean, we hear a lot of news, a lot of information, and there's a lot of gloom and doom out there right now, but what does the employment landscape really look like right now?
You know, I describe it as not as good as it was, but not as bad as we thought it would have been. Greenville is really fortunate to have such a diverse group of businesses here. And so what we have seen is that a lot of businesses, after that first initial shock of sort of what happened across the state and the country, we've seen a lot of businesses work very hard to go back to business as usual. A lot of hiring has happened. Our unemployment rate has dropped back down. Certainly not where we want it to be as a job seeker, but certainly better than it has been. And many of our businesses in our community have really pivoted to take advantage of some of the, let's call them silver linings of the times that we're in. So we've seen manufacturers pivot to begin to manufacture items such as PPE and other healthcare products. And we've seen a lot of our service industries really do very well getting back to business as usual.
Good. So people are hiring. Companies are hiring.
Yes, they are. They are. And certain sectors are better than others, but across the board, I think that we are, frankly, much more robust than maybe we would have expected at this point.
Got it. That's good to know. Because several organizations are experiencing changes in their respective workforces and their staffs, but it's good to know that there are opportunities out there for talent. From a talent perspective, what things have changed about the hiring process? So, you know, mid-March is when everything started shutting down. You know, the assumption is that things are a little different right now. What has changed since mid-March?
Yes, things are very different. And we can talk in a moment about what hasn't changed. But what really has changed is the position technology has placed in the process. We are so fortunate to be in 2020 and not 2000 or 1995 during this time. And I say that because what really has changed the most about the hiring process for most organizations is the use of technology in that process. I recently heard a speaker talking about promises that we have to unmake. Those organizations that would have never hired someone sight unseen are now fully handling their hiring process by video interviews such as Microsoft Teams or Zoom like we're on today, and finding that it's a very, very effective way not only to meet someone but to begin to integrate them in their team and throughout the onboarding process in some cases.
So we should be thankful for technology.
We should.
Right?
We should. We saw adoption happen very, very quickly. Even those with our, whether it be with our clients or candidate side, or even those in our very own office who may have been more reluctant to use those tools, very, very quickly began to see that as our lifeline to what we do every day.
Is it too early to tell whether hiring managers in organizations, is the risk higher by, not meeting with someone in person, not, gauging that firm handshake and things like that?
Gosh, Carlos, that's a wonderful question. It may be one of those we don't know until a little bit further down the road.
Mm-hmm.
But what I can say is that I think that in most cases, all of those steps an organization had arranged in their hiring process, they've built processes in a lot of cases very methodically. To not only include interviews, which frankly is one of the least predictive steps in the hiring process, but one that people, including me, are not willing to, to neglect. But in most cases, companies are also using skill and assessment testing to measure fit for the job. And those things certainly, are built on technology. So the actual process of meeting someone online rather than in person, though it's taken a lot of getting used to. And again, it's caused us, even as an organization, to say, we've always said we will meet someone face to face. We're never going to send someone out that we represent that we haven't. This is face to face today. And many of the jobs are remote as well. So that's been an interesting transition for many people to be hired and then also onboarded remotely. And so I think time will tell whether this is going to stick, but in a lot of cases, it certainly has saved people a lot of time and money, during this time. And I have a feeling that a lot of that will continue.
Well, and, I'm assuming that transitioning to technology allows the employer to gauge one's technology acumen.
It is. And sometimes that is the interviewer as well.
So today, as we were logging on to today's show, I had a full conversation and didn't realize that I was muted. And I'm a slow learner because clearly I've been doing that for like the past 5 months. So I would probably not get the job if I were interviewing for one today.
No, and that's certainly something that we're providing advice to job seekers on, is if you're not comfortable with technology, many of us weren't a few months ago, and many of us still are getting used to it. But if you're not comfortable, it's really important to practice, download the software, turn on your computer, make sure how your background looks. Those things are really important. So, as we always talked about in the past, preparing for an interview, this is different. I mean, you not only have to prepare yourself physically and dress up the part, and you dress for success and prepare how you might respond to questions and researching the company, but also making sure that your setup is such that it's somewhat professional in the background. Even if it's at home, it can be non-distractive and professional, but also making sure that you have your door closed and you don't have interruptions, or the TV or radio on, or phone ringing. That seems to be a common one lately. So I think that there are just a lot of ways that, as much as things have changed, they've stayed the same.
Right. Julie, one of the things I've been impressed with over these past 5 months is how well read people are, at least based on their backgrounds that they have. A lot of folks have backgrounds with all these books in the background. And I'm thinking to myself, there's no way they could have read all of those books, but it looks pretty impressive.
It does. It's interesting. I've heard a recent comment that that's actually a very distracting background, because we spend our time trying to figure out, is Carlos got a, Kentucky football book sitting next to the Clemson Tiger, history of Clemson book. And so we've laughed about that a lot, that, particularly on TV, you see the professors with all these books behind them. And, there's been some really interesting, if not funny, commentary about things that people might spot in someone's background. And so I think that is important. So to be very serious about this, not sitting in bed for an interview, making sure you're sitting up straight with a reasonably, at least non-distracted background behind you, testing the technology beforehand. And, one of the things we've always talked about is being on time for an interview. And with technology, it might be even more important because you've got to prepare for the possibility or likelihood that you have a glitch. So, early may not be 10 minutes, it might be 15 or 20 to make sure that you can get on and are there when the interviewer is ready for you.
Yeah. So we were talking about technology and how it has entered into our interview process. So that's fairly new phenomena. But what has not changed? And you've already shared a couple of things that have not changed, but there are some things that are still tried and true. You still need to show up on time and things like that. What are some other things that have remained constant in today's interviewing environment?
Right. I think number one is, still during an interview, putting your best foot forward is important. I think all of us, those who are working and those who are not, have probably gotten a little more casual. There are a few days here where I wear flip-flops to work. I never would have done that before. Seeing clients.
I can't imagine that, Julie.
But you never know what's below the waist, right?
Right.
But I will say that taking that interview seriously and making sure that you're prepared really physically as if you're interviewing in person, so appropriate for the job, whatever that environment is. And as I say, just preparing from a standpoint of not taking it too casually. Researching the company, that will never change. The fortune we have today is that it's really easy to do. We used to, I can age myself by telling you we'd send people to the library to research a company, or we'd mail them something on that company. But today researching a company is easier than ever. You've got tools like Glassdoor, LinkedIn, obviously the company website. But you can not only find out about the company, what they want you to hear, but you can find out what other people say about it. And really going into an interview, knowing a little bit about the company and their markets and even their value proposition and their core values of their workforce is really important. So that hasn't changed, and I can't imagine that it ever would. Preparing your own self in terms of, how do you answer the questions about those typical interview questions about your experience and your career goals, being prepared with that information. And really, I always tell job seekers, think about this in 3 or 4 buckets. What are those buckets that almost any question you're asked is going to fall into one of those? And that might be, what you've learned and your strengths and what you still want to learn and where you want to go, tough spots you've been in and how you've handled those. Structured interviewing is been in place for a long time, and your most sophisticated companies are still using a fairly structured interview process, and frankly, you can prepare ahead of time fairly well for that, even if you don't know the exact question that will be asked. Handling yourself well during the interview. There are people in the workforce now, Carlos, that have not ever had to look for a job. And as tough as that is, it's not something we really want to get a lot of experience in. I mean, people, you don't want to have been into that position, dozens of times. But I think sometimes those most insecure in the process are those who say, I haven't had to look for a job in 20 years. But that's a great thing. That's a good thing.
Right.
And so I would say that just, if you haven't had to look for a job in a lot of years, I think the biggest thing to know is just that interview process, it may start with a, hey, how you doing? How's the family? But it's going to tend to be a little more structured. But in a way, that's a blessing because it will allow you to best prepare for it by thinking through what you've learned in your career and sort of those broad buckets of answers that you might have the opportunity to give.
Right. Well, and we're pretty fortunate in that in today's times, most employees, I think they're transitioning to a new job or a new organization every 3 to 5 years. So the kind of the gold watch environment is long gone. if you will. Rarely does an individual stay with an organization for 30, 40 years. So I think there's transitions that were already taking place. So folks should probably be, more adept with interviewing. So that's probably a good thing. Thanks for sharing that information on what has not changed. That's helpful. Now, let me remind our attendees to submit questions via the chat. So want to know what's on your mind, want to answer any of your questions. Now, Julie, I told you that I was probably going to throw you a curveball question in the interview. I know you can hit fastballs, but let's see how you can handle this curveball. You've been sharing tips from the employee perspective or the prospective employee perspective, sharing tips with them. What are some tips for hiring managers during this time? Are there some things that hiring managers should be mindful of? What has changed for them during this time?
Okay, Carlos. Always get payback goes round and round.
Yeah.
That's a great question. It's a great question. And, I think one thing that a good HR friend and I were just talking about is, for those who you're interviewing somebody in transition, one of the things I want to know is what have they done during that transition? The typical interview questions and the typical interview is directed on their past experience and frankly, how that will predict their experience and their success with your company. I mean, that's all this process is about, is how do we predict success within your organization, not just the job you're hiring them for, but that long-term progression of their career or longer-term progression of their career. But, one of the things I'm most interested in when I meet a candidate today is what have they been doing during that transition? So you're laid off in March. I don't think that's a black mark on your resume whatsoever. Everybody's going to remember this time. I tell my kids, they're going to say, oh yeah, you were in college during COVID. Hopefully it's a one-year problem, but that's going to be something people remember. But what have you been doing? And what I want to hear, and I'll give the job seeker maybe just a little piece of advice. That question should be getting at the motivation. What have you done to better yourself? So that's one of the things I'm going to want to know from a job seeker is, have they been, improving on their technology skills? Have they been learning something? Have they gotten a new certification? Have they been reading? People are more active than ever on social media right now. On that note, that's another tip for a job seeker is keep in mind that these business-oriented social media platforms are career and professional platforms. So, whether they would admit it or not, most of the companies out there are perusing and going to notice if you have had a unprofessional communication on those platforms. So keeping everything very positive. We don't ever want to hear that someone is negative about their prior employers, but we also all have an opportunity to sort of present ourselves, I think, in a positive way in terms of just our general brand or general image. So that's another thing that companies are looking for. So I'm not sure if I'm dodging your question, Carlos, at all, but I think that companies right now are looking for a lot of the things that they've always looked for, but I hate to tell you, in some ways, the answer is easier to find.
Right. Well, Julie, you're still at bat. So I'm still going to throw you some pitches here. I would think that one of the things that employers could be is exercise a bit more empathy, I think, right now. So, I'm interviewing Carlos, and he didn't know that his microphone was muted. And his background, I may not like his background, but is that necessarily a bad thing? So from an employer perspective, perhaps exercising a bit more empathy, be a bit more forgiving of the person on the other end, on the other side of the camera, might be helpful.
No, I couldn't agree more. I just participated in a discussion, and I'm actually going to share it with my team later this week, on, sort of unconscious bias. So you have to watch that. It's one thing when you're evaluating somebody on a paper resume or on the screen, and then you meet them in person. But, when you're interviewing someone, they're likely in their home, how relevant is it that they, you don't share the same decorating style, or maybe that they're not in a professional type environment. So I think you're exactly right, Carlos. I think we have to watch not only that we do have empathy for those who maybe are just not used to this process, because frankly, none of us have been for long,
Right.
but also just a little bit forgiving. I think if they may be interviewing in Starbucks because they don't have Wi-Fi at home, or what is that, and really how relevant is that to whether they will be successful in the role that you're hiring for.
All right. Thanks for sharing those tips for employers. Now let's transition back to the talent, the employee. I can remember when interviewing for jobs, one of the things I like to do was follow up with a handwritten note. After I interviewed for the Greenville Chamber for this job, I really wanted this position. I wanted it so bad that I left the interview. I walked to the CVS there at Main and McBee, bought some thank you notes, and I went back to the hotel room and I hand wrote thank you notes to every person on the search committee. Now, I had a little writer's cramp after doing that, but I wanted to show how much I appreciated the opportunity to interview, and also wanted to communicate, I really want this job. Where have handwritten notes gone, and is this still a good idea, or how should a person best follow up following an interview these days?
It's a wonderful question. And I'll start by saying, if you asked 5 people, you might get 5 answers. But one thing is for sure is that follow-up period is important, regardless of the method. I'm a believer, and again, call me a little old-fashioned, but I'm a believer in the handwritten note, because frankly, we don't get as many as we used to. So those we do get stand out. I've got a great story on this, Carlos, if you'll give me the latitude. I've got a client from years ago. He's long retired now. I still run into him, and just someone that was a very thoughtful individual, but a tough guy. And he tells a story of interviewing for a job, following up with a letter explaining why he felt like he was a fit. I don't even think it was a note. I think it was a pure letter. The client the employer chose someone else for the job. They let him know this. He wrote another note back saying that he wished them well, he understood, but again, this is why I felt like I was a fit, but a very gracious thank you. Within a couple of weeks, the person who had accepted that job reneged on the offer. I can't remember if it was a family didn't want to relocate or what it was. They called my friend, who had been my client, back. 30 years later, he retired from that job. And I'll tell you, he is a chamber member, a law firm, and he was the administrator there for 30 years.
Oh, wow.
And some will know who I'm talking about. But bottom line is the difference in them going back to him versus starting that process had a lot to do with that follow-up. So I'm a fan of a handwritten note. COVID, a lot of people aren't in the office. So, one possibility, Carlos, may be ask the interviewer, would I follow up with you? Do you prefer that I do it by email? Do you prefer that I send you a note? If so, should I use the work address? Some of our hiring officials are not physically in the office now. And so they may not get that note in a timely manner. I'm still a fan of it. But so the answer would be, number 1, follow up no matter how you do it. And number 2, maybe ask that question. I think it's a good piece of advice, just to say, I'd like to, when I follow up with you, how do you prefer that I do that?
Wow. Wonderful advice. And follow-up is still so very important. And so good to know that there's still value in the follow-up. We have a question in the chat. And the question is, are there any special tips you have for older job seekers? I'm almost 60. I don't have to work, but I want to. And a person has a 30-year IT background. First of all, I would tell you to reach out to Godshall Recruiting.
I hope they already have. That's
exactly. For some one-on-one counseling and assistance there, but just in general for the older talent that still wants to work and is seeking opportunities. Any advice for them?
Yes, I'll tell you, absolutely, you are more focused on it than the employer is. I can tell you that I've seen people at all ages, stages of life, much more concerned about their age and stage than the employer is. The employer should be focused on your skills and your fit, your values within that organization, and how they predict your success for them. And, that sounds like lip service, but I can tell you that, someone who has been in the workforce for longer, and I'm not too far from this person's stage and age, you have an awful lot to bring. You have a lot of leadership and experience, and as long as you have kept your skills updated and current, which is our responsibility as an employee to keep our skills up to date. Back to the gold watch, that used to be the employers did it. We thought it was their job. It's ours now. But I can promise you're more focused on it. So I guess the answer would be, don't focus on it. Your resume may not need to go back to the beginning of time. It may not need to go back all the way to the beginning of your career unless you've been with your company all those years. And I'd always, include that. But if you've had several positions over that time, there's no need to go back to older skills that are not relevant. You're only highlighting your time in the workforce there. And if you feel it's a concern, that's what that does. But I can just tell you that your fear is not warranted. I don't believe in most cases. I just don't. And I believe other people in my position and others in the hiring mode for a corporation would agree. As long as your skill set is relevant and current, and if it's not, that's something that you should concentrate on during the search process. But I do believe that it's less of a concern than sometimes the job seeker has about it.
Good. That is excellent advice, Julie, and a wonderful question in the chat. So thank you. So, Julie, we've covered a lot of information, and when we were in our production meeting, we talked about the opportunity to leave participants on today's program, and then those who may view the program in the future, with 3 to 5 pro tips. If there were 3 to 5 things that you think talent needs to know right now to increase their chances of success in finding their next great career, what would those 3 to 5 pro tips be?
Okay. And I won't add where the interviewer's team colors, which is what Carlos has done for me today. So go Tiger.
Look, let me tell you something. I'm still interviewing, Julie.
As a guy who comes from Kentucky, that was generous.
I'm still interviewing for the job.
We all are. We all are. One thing I would say we talked about follow-up, but I would say on the front end, in addition to applying, the application process can not only be intimidating, it can feel like you're sending this resume into a black hole. Network in addition to applying. Find out who you know that may work in that organization, or network with people, comment on their LinkedIn profiles. Make sure to supplement that application with some networking. That would be number one. We talked about preparation. Can't ignore that during any time. So, research not only the company, but also prepare yourself. I'll call it execute. Professionalism, positivity during that interview process. Make sure that you put that first, the first impression is always important, whether it's in person or by video. So that would be next. Follow up, whether it be an email or handwritten note, and you might ask the interviewer which they prefer. And then stay positive. During times like this, people tend to it's very difficult, I think, for us to not show our frustration or not show our emotion, and that can't be a positive thing in this process. So demonstrating frustration, whether it be during the interview with your layoff situation or your job change or position, or after, if you haven't heard and you're following up, do everything you can to stay positive and not demonstrate that emotion or frustration during the process. That can't be anything but a negative at that point, and it's really, really tough sometimes when you are truly frustrated, and for good reason.
Right.
So those would be my sort of, is that 4 or 5, maybe 6 if you had the team color.
No, that's good.
Just send you homework.
Good. Those were excellent, excellent tips, and I think folks it would benefit them to follow those. So thank you for sharing those. One last question on the chat before we wrap up. Job seekers who are searching work from home options to accommodate the unique back to school option for children. How can job seekers adjust to a new working environment? So, we've talked about the cell phones ringing, the dogs barking, and what have you. Here in a couple of weeks, we're going to have a phenomena of kids at home. So you may be interviewing for a job while trying to help your child with their algebra class. I guess algebra, people still take algebra in school. But that's a phenomena that not only should the employee be mindful of, but the employer has to be mindful of that as well. Maybe that's where the empathy and what have you comes in for the employer.
It's tough. I mean, it's tough to look for a job, to interview, and frankly, to work, when you've got so much going on. I think back to days when many of us were working with small children, but at least other than if they were sick, you had a schedule. You knew when they were going to go to school. You knew when, other than an illness, you could sort of make a plan. It's very difficult for people to make a plan. I think the best advice I can give would be to enlist the help of family or babysitters for at least a portion of the day, so that I read an article recently about windows, separating your day into windows. So if nap time starts at this time, or if this is a time your child is going to be on the computer with schoolwork and focused on that, make sure to be ready to use that window of time appropriately, knowing that then in the next hour you may have to be tutoring on algebra. I'm not sure I can do that anymore, but maybe that's the time that you do that. So the best advice I can give you would be you might share with friends or coworkers or family, husband, wife, anyone else in the household who say, I can have 9 to 10. You have 10 to 11, and kind of window or structure that time into times that you can be uninterrupted if possible. I think most employers have empathy. They recognize that you're home. They recognize kids are maybe or maybe not in school, depending on the day of the week and the letter of the alphabet and your last name or whatever we are. But I will say that it's very difficult to be effective if you don't at least have some uninterrupted time. So the best advice I could give is, if you've got others in your life, that you can share that responsibility to at least get windows to do that video interview, or to spend on a phone call without interruption. It'll go a long way.
Good. Excellent advice, Julie. We're wrapping up today's program. Any parting words of wisdom from you today?
I do. I think the biggest thing that people have to do is continue to look forward. Don't let this time, which is, I truly hope and believe and pray that it will be a blip in history that we'll all remember vividly, but don't let this time set you off on the wrong career trajectory. You still need to be choosy. Make sure that you are choosing a role that puts you, one step forward in your career. It's very difficult to take 2 steps backwards and then leap forward. So obviously we're all dependent on our income to pay our mortgage or pay our rent. So I certainly understand taking temporary or contract or even part-time work while you're looking. But when you select that right next career role, make sure that it keeps you on the proper trajectory to meet your goals long term.
Good. Again, excellent advice there. Julie, I feel like I could talk to you for a couple more hours. This has really been a great conversation, and you've provided our listeners today and future listeners with some really great advice on how to succeed in today's job search. So thank you for being here and for sharing your thoughts with today's participants.
Well, thank you for opening up the conversation and allowing me to share. I've really appreciated it and all you do.
Good. And for anybody who's seeking career opportunities and you need a little one-on-one counsel, there's Julie. Give her a call. Today's recording will be shared on Greenville Chamber's website and sent to attendees along with a survey. Please complete the survey because it does inform and influence our future programming. Don't forget that this is part of an ongoing series. Next week, we will speak with Mayor Knox White for an update on the state of our city. And there's a lot going on in Greenville, and you may be surprised at what the mayor communicates to us next week. We take time at the end of every call to remind everyone to please do your part in helping to stop the spread of the coronavirus. Remember, mask, wash, and distance. Those three things are very important as we try to reopen our economy safely, get kids back to school safely, and hopefully be able to go and be able to attend a Clemson football game in the next few weeks. So make sure that you're doing your part. And everyone, please, look at that. There you go, Julie. Excellent job. And do like Julie. Stay positive and test negative. Thank you all for joining us today.